Before buying a laptop for music production, there's a couple of questions that you need to ask yourself instead of buying the most expensive thing and wasting your money, or worse, buying a machine that's not going to be able to handle your workload. In this video, I will go through the different components of a laptop and tell you how they benefit you, and then towards the end, I'll give recommendations based on your budget and workflow. So the big question is Mac or Windows? And the answer to this is very simple. If you like Mac, stick with Mac. If you like Windows, stick with that. And if you don't know what you like, keep watching. Personally, I use both and I don't have a favorite, but there are two things that you need to know. Number one, Windows does not share MIDI, which is kind of annoying. What this means is if you have two programs that are accessing the same MIDI controller at the same time, one of them will either give you an error or not function properly. On my PC, I always have MIDI controllers connected, and if I were to open Virtual DJ or any software that recognizes the controller, FL Studio would not be able to use it. It gives an error. And to solve this, I have to close both programs and then open FL Studio before Virtual DJ. Mac does not have this problem. Number two, on Mac, you get the same performance whether the laptop is plugged in or running on battery power, whereas on Windows, you're very likely to get a dip in performance whenever the laptop is unplugged. But ultimately, the experience is the same on both as far as music production is concerned. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the components, starting with the storage. There's two things to consider here: speed and size. There are SSDs, solid state drives, which are faster but expensive, and then there are HDDs, hard disk drives, which are slower and cheaper. Ideally, you want to have 3 hard drives. One is the internal and it must be an SSD. For this, I would recommend a minimum of 500 gigabytes. The next drive, which should also be an SSD, is to store your sample libraries and files for active projects. This should be at least 500 gigs as well, but if you make music that heavily relies on sample-based synthesizers, for instance, if you use Contact and Omnisphere, then this second drive needs to be a lot bigger. And then finally, the third hard drive can be an HDD, and this would be an archive for all the finished projects. 1 terabyte should be the base for this. These numbers are for if you only make music and nothing else, but if you create content, then you need a lot more storage. The structure remains the same, but the sizes of the hard drives changes. On my personal computer, I make music and I also edit videos, and in that computer, I have a total of 6 hard drives. The structure is still the same, it just has some extra steps. Now, of course, those hard drives are internal and you can't do that on a laptop. So on the laptop, I use the Samsung T7 1 terabyte for active storage, and then for archives, I use a 1 terabyte Seagate drive. I'll have links below for everything that I talk about in this video, including the T7 from Samsung. If you're new to this channel, my name is Tozy and I make videos about music production, DJing, and the tech involved. If that's something you're into, please consider subscribing, and let's get back to the video. Now let's talk about the 3 components that will dictate how smooth your workflow will be. These are the CPU, RAM, and GPU. Kinda. If you can understand these and how they work, you'll be able to look at any computer online and be able to tell if it's good enough for you or not. For the longest of times, these 3 components have always been separate parts. They still are in most laptops, but in late 2020, Apple took a different route. They essentially took these components and combined them into a single chip called an SoC. They still do the same thing in Apple machines, but they work kind of different, and we're gonna get into that shortly. For now, I want to discuss the 3 components quickly. The CPU, which is the central processing unit or just processor, is the brain of the computer. Its performance depends on the clock speed and the core count. The clock speed is the number that usually appears next to the CPU name, measured in gigahertz, and the core count is the number of cores that it has, so 4, 6, 8, and so on. If you're gonna be doing a lot of things live, then you would benefit a lot from faster clock speeds, and then if you're gonna be doing a lot of mixing and stuff, then you would benefit from more cores. For a perfect balance, you wanna get the highest clock speed and the highest number of cores possible for your budget. As a start, I'd recommend an i5 or i7 from Intel and Ryzen 5 or 7 from AMD. On the Apple side of things, the base M1, M2, and M3 are more than enough. Moving on to RAM, the random access memory, or just memory. This is measured in gigabytes, and on the low end we have 8 gigabytes of RAM, and some beastly machines have an upwards of 128. This is where every software that you open is stored, and as soon as you close it, the space that it occupied gets cleared. So the more programs you have open on your machine, the more the RAM gets used up. And if you actually manage to fill it up, your laptop will start lagging. So if you don't have enough RAM, then you can only open a few programs at the same time, and if you have a lot of it, then you can go wild. RAM also has speed and latency, but honestly you don't even need to think about that because it doesn't make the kind of difference that you would notice. Just make sure that you're not buying the cheapest thing possible, and at the time of recording this video the latest generation of RAM is DDR5, but DDR4 is still mainstream and it's still very capable. If you're only going to be making music, then 16 gigs of RAM is enough on Windows, and if you're going to be doing editing or multitasking, then 32 is the sweet spot, and you can always go up to 64, but anything more than that is honestly overkill. That's only on Windows though. Remember that I told you that the SoCs on Macs work differently, so if you're going to be making music only on a Mac, then 8 gig is honestly enough. But if you're going to be dealing with simple bass VSTs or editing videos or multitasking, then I suggest 16 gigs as a start. Now the GPU, which is the graphics processing unit, does exactly what it sounds like. It handles everything that has to do with visuals. It has its own RAM called the VRAM, but it's different from the RAM that we just spoke about. And the reason why I said it only kind of matters is that if you're only making music, then the difference that it makes is not day and night. It does offload some work from your CPU, but not to a point where your laptop would suck without it. But given that it's 2024, you're very likely to be editing your own videos and creating your own cover art, and that is where you would benefit a lot from a GPU. Now that you have a clear understanding of these components, let's talk about Apple and why their machines work differently. Since they took these components and combined them into one chip, this means three things for the users. Number one is a performance increase. Since the information does not have to travel between the CPU, GPU, and RAM because it's all in one chip, then everything happens much quicker to a point where it kinda doesn't make sense. For instance, an 8-core CPU from Apple will outperform an 8-core CPU from Intel and AMD from the same year, like 90% of the time. It's the same with RAM. 16 gigs on an Apple machine is not the same as 16 gigs on a Windows machine. In my experience, it's more closer to 32. Number two is a price drop. Since Apple makes everything in-house, they don't need the middlemen to sell them the chips, so the cost of production drops, and now we get to buy Apple machines that offer great performance for a price less than half of what you'd need to pay for the M1. And then number three is an efficiency boost. So these machines use less power, they produce the least amount of heat, there's less fan noise, and the battery lasts very long, which is always a good thing. So because of this, you can still get the M1 MacBook Air, which was released like 4 years ago at this point, and it would still perform very well today. So what do I recommend? Well, if your budget is $500 or less and you want a good enough machine that's not going to make you lose your mind, then I suggest that you don't buy anything new. Look locally in the used market and judge using the information provided in this video. And if your budget is $1,000 or less, then to this day I still suggest the M1 MacBook Air we just spoke about. For the storage, you can even go with 250 gigs, it's fine. You can get a 1TB Samsung SSDs for less than what Apple would charge you to upgrade to 512. This laptop will handle music production and video editing with no problem, and again, everything will be linked down below. For $1,500 to $2,000, I recommend the Asus ZenBook Pro 14 OLED, which starts at $1,699. It comes with an overkill i9 CPU, 16 to 32 gigs of RAM, a TB SSD, and an Nvidia graphics card. On the Apple side, I recommend the 14-inch M3 Pro MacBook Pro, which starts at $1,999 and comes with 18 gigs of RAM and a 512 SSD. And then for a budget that is more than $2,500, the 16-inch M3 Max MacBook Pro is perfect for you. And on the Windows side, the Dell XPS 17 will serve you perfectly. Both of these can be spec'd out the way that you want, so you can go as wild as you need to. Thank you so much for watching this video till the end. I hope you got some value from it, and if you did, please consider subscribing and leave a comment and share some information that I might have left out. For 5 practical ways for music producers to make money, click here and I'll see you there. Peace.